I saw Karen harvesting my pecan trees. She said they were community property. The sound that woke me wasn't thunder. It wasn't the settling of an old house or the wind through the pecan branches that had sung me to sleep for 67 years. It was mechanical, industrial, wrong. I checked the clock on my nightstand. 5:47 a.m. The sun wasn't even thinking about rising yet, but something was happening in my grove. Something that made my bones ache before my mind caught up. I pulled on my robe and walked to the back porch. The same porch my father had built in 1952. The same boards my grandfather had replaced in 1978. My bare feet knew every creak, every warm spot, every memory pressed into that wood. But when I opened the screen door and looked out at my trees, my heart stopped dead in my chest. A tree shaker. An industrial tree shaker worth more than most cars, wrapped around the trunk of my oldest pecan tree, vibrating so hard the ground trembled beneath my feet. Nuts rained down like hail into massive collection bins. 6 people in matching vests moved through my grove with the efficiency of thieves who'd rehearsed their crime 100 times. And standing in the middle of it all, holding a tablet computer like a scepter, was a woman I'd never seen before. Blonde hair that didn't move in the morning breeze. A white blazer so clean it seemed to glow in the pre-dawn darkness. A smile that had all the warmth of a snake sizing up a mouse. I walked toward her. 67 years old, retired professor of botany, published author, expert witness in 14 property disputes. None of that mattered as much as one simple fact. These were my trees, my family's trees, and strangers were stripping them bare. Ma'am. My voice came out steady, professorial, the voice I'd used for 35 years in lecture halls. You are on private property. These are my trees. She turned to face me, and there it was, that look, the one I'd known since childhood, the one that said without words, "You don't belong here." You never did. "Mr. Carver, is it?" She tilted her head like she was examining a specimen. "I'm Tammy Jo Perkins, president of the Magnolia Heights Homeowners Association. These trees extend into the Community Agricultural Zone. Under Ordinance 12.7, any crops from that zone are community property." She gestured at the chaos around us with her tablet. "We're simply collecting what belongs to the neighborhood." I looked at my trees. The nearest one to my property line stood 60 feet inside my fence. Always had, always would. "Ma'am, I've owned this land for 40 years. My family has owned it for 134. Tammy Jo Perkins smiled wider. That particular smile. "Well, times change, don't they? Neighborhoods evolve. You might want to check the new survey. Your claim may not be as solid as you think." She stepped closer. Her perfume was expensive and aggressive, the kind designed to mark territory. When she spoke again, her voice dropped to a whisper meant only for me. "Between us, a man like you, owning land like this, in a neighborhood like ours." She let the words hang there, poisonous. "People talk. Maybe it's time to consider other options." I'd been called names before. I'd been followed in stores, pulled over for driving while black, passed over for promotions that went to less qualified colleagues. 67 years in America teaches you that some people see your skin before they see you. But standing in my own backyard, watching strangers steal my heritage while this woman whispered threats dressed up as friendly advice, that was something else entirely. "Mrs. Perkins," I said, and my voice didn't waver even though something ancient was rising in my chest, "I suggest you take your crew and leave my property. Now." She laughed, actually laughed. "We'll be done within the hour. You'll receive an invoice for your share of the processing costs." She turned her back on me like I was dismissed, like I was nothing. The crew continued working. The tree shaker roared. Pecans fell like tears, and I stood there in my robe, watching everything my family had built being stripped away in the darkness before dawn. They didn't leave within the hour. They left within 2, after filling 3 industrial containers with nuts my great-great-grandfather's trees had spent a year growing. When the last truck pulled away, the silence that settled over my grove felt like a funeral. I walked among the trees as the sun finally crested the horizon. The damage was worse than I'd feared. Branches snapped and hanging like broken arms. Bark scraped raw where the shaker had gripped too tight, exposing pale wood that would be vulnerable to disease and insects. Green, unripe nuts scattered across the ground. They hadn't even bothered to collect everything, just took what was easy and left the rest to rot. I moved from tree to tree, cataloging the wounds with the precision of 35 years of botanical training. 3 major branches broken on the north side of Abigail. That tree had been Isaiah's wife's favorite, the one she'd sit beneath to shell nuts in the autumn evenings. Deep scoring on the trunk of freedom, the tree we'd planted when my grandfather came home from the First World War with a medal and a limp he'd carry the rest of his life. The mechanical shaker had torn away a strip of bark nearly 2 feet long on hope. The tree my father planted the day the Supreme Court handed down Brown versus Board of Education. Each tree had a name. Each tree had a story. Each tree was a chapter in my family's history, and these strangers had treated them like nothing, like obstacles, like things to be stripped and discarded. I found myself counting the damage like counting casualties after a battle. 14 trees with significant branch damage. 23 with bark wounds that would need treatment. 4 with root disturbance from the heavy equipment they'd driven across the grove without care or permission. 47 trees. My great-great-grandfather, Isaiah Carver, planted 47 pecan trees on this land in 1890. I know the exact number because he told my great-grandmother, and she told my grandmother, and she told my father, and he told me. 47 trees. 1 for every year his father spent in chains. Isaiah was born free. His father was not. When the Emancipation Proclamation came, when the chains finally fell, Isaiah's father was 47 years old. He'd spent his entire life as property. Every birthday, every sunrise, every breath he took belonged to someone else. He died 3 years later, worn out by a life that was never allowed to be his own. Isaiah swore that would never happen again. He worked every job he could find, saved every penny, walked 40 miles to the county seat to file the paperwork because no one would give a black man a ride. And in 1890, he bought this land. 40 acres of Georgia clay that had probably been worked by slaves just like his father. He bought it legal, bought it proper, bought it with money he'd earned with his own 2 hands. And then he planted 47 trees. 1 for every year Pa was in chains, he told his wife Abigail as they dug the holes together. These trees will stand when we're gone. They'll feed our children and our children's children. Nobody will ever take from a Carver again. I knelt beside the oldest tree in the grove. We call him Isaiah, naturally. His trunk is wider than I can reach around. His branches shade half an acre. His roots go deeper than anyone knows. And now there were fresh wounds in his bark, raw and weeping sap like blood. My fingers found something in the damaged bark. A piece that had fallen away, exposing the heartwood beneath. I picked it up, turned it over in my hands, and felt my throat tighten. Carved into that piece of bark, faded but unmistakable, were initials. I.C. 1890. Isaiah Carver, the first mark of a free man on his own land. I sat down right there in the dirt, holding that piece of bark, and for the first time in the 2 years since my wife Dorothy passed, I cried. Not from grief this time. From rage. From a fury so deep and so old it felt like it had been waiting in my bones since 1890, passed down through generations, waiting for this moment. They came for Isaiah's trees. They came for everything my family had built. They came with their machines and their fake smiles and their whispered threats, and I was supposed to just let them take it. I wiped my face with the sleeve of my robe, looked around at my wounded grove. 47 trees that had survived droughts and floods and storms, and 100 different people who thought they could take what belonged to the carvers. Prepare, I said aloud. That's what we called Isaiah in our family. Prepare, the first father. They came again. Different faces, different words, but the same eyes. The same hands, reaching for what isn't theirs. The morning sun was warm on my face. The trees rustled in the breeze, the same breeze that had whispered through these branches for 134 years. But we're still here, I said, and we're not going anywhere. I pushed myself to my feet. There was work to do. The Magnolia Heights HOA operated out of a building that used to be a bank. White columns, marble floors, and the kind of aggressive air conditioning that announced money lived here. I'd driven past it 1,000 times without ever having reason to go inside. Now I walked through those doors carrying a folder that contained everything my family had ever owned. The original deed from 1890, the unbroken chain of ownership across 5 generations, the property survey conducted when I bought out my siblings' shares in 1984, every piece of paper that proved what I already knew in my blood. That land was mine. Tammy Jo Perkins was waiting for me in the lobby. Not behind a desk, not in an office, waiting for me, like she knew I'd come. 2 men in suits stood behind her. One held a folder of his own. Mr. Carver. Her smile was the same as before. So glad you decided to come to us. This will make things much easier. She led me to a conference room and unrolled a large map across the table. My property was right in the center, but something was wrong. The boundary lines had moved. According to this map, my property line had shifted 200 feet inward. My house was still on my land, barely. But the grove, all 47 trees, now sat inside something labeled Magnolia Heights Agricultural Commons. This map is fraudulent, I said. I have the original survey from 1890. Tammy tilted her head with exaggerated sympathy. Those old documents, Mr. Carver. You know how things were back then. Records were so unreliable, especially for certain... She paused. Let me understand what she meant. Transactions. One of the men stepped forward with his folder. Our surveyor identified significant discrepancies in the historical records. There are questions about whether the original sale was conducted properly, whether the land was ever legally transferred at all. I felt cold, not afraid. Cold. The way you feel when you understand exactly what kind of evil you're facing. What are you suggesting? I asked. Nothing yet. Tammy's voice was sweet as poison. We're simply looking into it. In the meantime, she pulled out a stack of papers, an invoice. $47,000 for unauthorized agricultural use of community land, 3 years of back assessments, $12,000 for tree maintenance and hazard mitigation. A notice that failure to pay within 30 days would result in a property lien. This is extortion, I said. This is community governance, Mr. Carver. Everyone has to pay their fair share. If you'd like to dispute the assessment, there are procedures. Forms to fill out, hearings to schedule. She leaned forward. But between you and me, it might be simpler to just let go. We've had interest from developers. We could arrange a fair offer for your property. Let you move somewhere more comfortable. I looked at the invoice, then at the map. Then at Tammy Jo Perkins and the men behind her, all looking at me like I was a problem to be solved. I've spent 35 years teaching botany. I've published 3 books on Carya illinoinensis, the scientific name for the pecan tree. I've testified as an expert witness in 14 property disputes involving trees and land use. I've forgotten more about property law than most lawyers ever learn. And more importantly, I'm George Washington Carver III, named for the great black scientist who revolutionized Southern agriculture. My family has spent 134 years protecting this land from people who thought they could take it because of the color of our skin. I folded the papers neatly and put them in my pocket. Old habits from decades of grading student work. Mrs. Perkins, I said, I spent 35 years teaching botany. I've written 3 books on pecan cultivation. I've testified as an expert witness in 14 property disputes involving trees. She blinked. The men behind her shifted uncomfortably. But more importantly, my family has spent 134 years protecting this land from people who thought they could take it because of the color of our skin. I turned toward the door. "You're not the first," I said over my shoulder. "You won't be the last, but like everyone before you." I stopped in the doorway and looked back. You will fail. The next 3 weeks taught me that Tammy Jo Perkins was not a woman who tolerated being told no. The first inspector arrived on Monday morning. Code enforcement, allegedly responding to a complaint about hazardous vegetation. He was a young white man with a clipboard and the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. He introduced himself as Tommy Greer, said he was required to conduct a comprehensive vegetation assessment. "Sir, I need to assess the condition of your trees," he said, not meeting my eyes. "We received reports of potential Dutch elm disease." "These are pecan trees," I said. "Carya illinoinensis. Dutch elm disease only affects elms. That's a different genus entirely." He flushed red and made a note on his clipboard. "I'm just doing my job, sir." I let him walk through the grove. He took notes I couldn't read, photographs I couldn't see, and left without telling me anything except that I'd receive a report within 7 to 10 business days. He didn't know the difference between an elm and a pecan, but he was going to write a report that could determine the fate of my property. Tuesday brought animal control. A woman named Patricia something, concerned about wildlife harboring in dense vegetation. She spent an hour looking for evidence of dangerous animals in my grove. She found squirrels. She found songbirds. She found a rabbit burrow that had been there since my father's time. She declared all of it potentially hazardous to the community and promised a follow-up inspection. Wednesday brought the health department. Someone had complained about nut debris creating allergen hazards for neighborhood residents. The inspector, a heavy-set man who wheezed when he walked, informed me that I might be required to install allergen warning signage at 50 feet. Intervals around my property line. "Who complained?" I asked him. "That information is confidential, sir. The nearest house is 800 feet from my nearest tree." He shrugged. "Allergens can travel." Thursday was the fire marshal, concerned about overgrown vegetation near power lines. The power lines were 100 feet from the nearest tree. I showed him on a map. He made notes anyway. Every inspector was white. Everyone avoided my eyes. Everyone left with notes and photographs and promised reports that would arrive within 7 to 10 business days. Every one of them was laying the groundwork for something, building a paper trail that could be used against me later. Friday, my bank called. "Mr. Carver, this is Cheryl at First Southern. I'm calling to inform you about a lien request we've received against your property." "From whom?" "The Magnolia Heights Homeowners Association. The amount is $59,000, sir." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. I've never been a member of that HOA. I've never agreed to their authority over my property. "I understand, sir, but until this is resolved, we'll need to place a hold on any transactions involving your accounts. It's just procedure. Just procedure. They were strangling me with procedure. Saturday night, someone threw a brick through my mailbox. Sunday morning, I found dead crows scattered across my driveway. 3 of them, arranged in a pattern that felt ancient and threatening, a message that needed no words. Monday brought the arborist. Not any arborist, one with an HOA badge hanging from his lanyard. He spent 2 hours in my grove without permission, taking samples I didn't authorize, examining trees that belonged to me and me alone. "Mr. Carver," he said as he was leaving, "I have to inform you that 12 of your trees show signs of significant disease. I'll be recommending immediate removal for the safety of the community." I knew those trees. I'd spent my entire career studying trees just like them. They were healthy, they were strong, they would outlive every person in that HOA. "Get off my property," I said. He smiled. It was Tammy's smile. They'd all learned it from her. That night I walked my grove with a flashlight. Something felt wrong, different. I couldn't place it until I reached the northeast corner where 3 of my younger trees stood. Saplings I'd planted myself when Dorothy and I got married 40 years ago. Their leaves were yellowing in August. I knelt down and examined the soil. The smell hit me immediately. Chemical, acrid, wrong. Someone had poured herbicide around the roots, not enough to kill them immediately. Just enough to make them look diseased, just enough to justify the arborist's recommendation. I collected soil samples in mason jars. I photographed everything. I documented the damage with the methodical precision of 35 years of scientific training. And then I sat on the ground between those poison trees in the dark and made myself a promise. I would find out everything. I would document every crime. I would build a case so solid that no judge, no jury, no bureaucrat could ignore it. And then I would destroy them. The Blanco County Records Office is housed in a building that hasn't changed much since the 1920s. The floors creak. The filing cabinets are older than I am. And the woman behind the counter, Margaret Ann Foster, has been working there since Nixon was president. "Professor Carver," she said when I walked in, "haven't seen you since you helped us with that tree survey back in 09. What brings you in?" "I need to see everything you have on my property, Margaret Ann, and everything you have on the Magnolia Heights HOA. She raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. Margaret Ann had lived in this county her whole life. She'd seen things. It took her an hour to pull the files. I spread them across a research table and began the work I'd done 1,000 times before, following the paper trail. My property records were exactly as I remembered them. Clear title going back to 1890, unbroken chain of ownership. Every I dotted, every T crossed. Isaiah Carver had been meticulous, probably because he knew someone would eventually try to claim it wasn't legal for a black man to own this land. The HOA files were more interesting. Magnolia Heights had been established in 1987 when a developer carved up the old Harrison farm into half-acre lots with deed restrictions and mandatory membership. My property, which had been here for almost a century by then, was explicitly excluded from the development. The original plat map showed my 40 acres as a white space in the middle of their carefully planned community, marked Non-Participating Parcel, Carver Family Trust. But the new map, the one Tammy had shown me, told a different story. Someone had redrawn the boundaries. Someone had erased that white space and extended the HOA's reach 200 feet into my land. I looked at the filing date. 6 months ago. I looked at the surveyor who'd signed off on the changes. James Thornton, licensed surveyor. I looked at James Thornton's license record. Revoked. 2019. Fraudulent surveys. The pieces were falling into place, but I needed more. I dug deeper into the HOA's financial records. Public documents that any resident could request, though most people never bothered. And there, buried in the quarterly reports, under line items so vague they meant nothing, I found it. a contract between Magnolia Heights HOA and Southern Pecan Processors, Inc. amount dated 3 years ago. Value, $200,000 annually for harvesting rights to community pecan resources. $200,000 a year for my pecans. For nuts that grew on trees my great-great-grandfather had planted with his own hands. The signature at the bottom belonged to Tammy Jo Perkins. But that wasn't the worst part. When I cross-referenced the HOA's financial statements, the official documents they filed with the county, the ones that were supposed to account for every penny, the $200,000 never appeared as income. It didn't show up in the operating budget. It didn't show up in the reserve fund. It didn't show up anywhere a legitimate payment should appear. Instead, it vanished into a line item called Community Beautification Fund, Administrative Expenses. Administrative expenses. A catch-all phrase that meant nothing and hid everything. I kept digging. The Beautification Fund had one authorized signatory for withdrawals, Tammy Jo Perkins. No oversight committee, no board approval required, no annual audit. Just Tammy writing checks to herself from a fund no one else could access. I pulled the Beautification Fund's disbursement records, payments to contractors I'd never heard of. Companies with names like TMJ Consulting and Perkins Property Services. The addresses were P.O. boxes. The invoices were vague descriptions of landscaping oversight and community enhancement coordination. The work described was fictional. The money was very, very real. She'd built herself a money machine, and my trees were the engine. She wasn't just stealing my pecans. She was stealing from her own HOA while she did it, pocketing $200,000 a year while her neighbors paid their dues, thinking it was going to road repairs and pool maintenance. I requested copies of everything. Margaret Ann printed them without comment, page after page after page, the old printer whirring and clicking like it understood the weight of what it was producing. When she handed me the stack of papers, her hand lingered on mine for a moment. "Professor," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. "Be careful. Some of these people, they don't fight fair. They never have." "Neither did my great-great-grandfather," I said, "and he won." I almost missed the last piece of evidence. It was in a folder marked Development Proposals, pending, tucked behind applications for swimming pool permits and requests for speed bumps. Perkins Development, LLC. A proposal for a 200-unit subdivision on land that, according to the attached survey, would become available following resolution of agricultural zoning issues. The land in question was mine. Perkins Development, LLC was registered to Marcus Perkins, Tammy Jo Perkins' husband, and attached to the proposal was an internal memo, clearly never meant for public files, that must have been misfiled by someone careless or someone with a conscience. Carver parcel equals $4.2 million development potential. Primary obstacle, current owner unlikely to sell. Recommend aggressive code enforcement plus HOA pressure. Property value will drop significantly after tree removal. Low ball offer, $400,000 maximum. Expect acceptance once financial pressure becomes untenable. I read that memo 3 times. They weren't just stealing my harvest. They weren't just trying to extort me with fake fees. They were systematically trying to destroy everything my family had built so they could buy the ruins for pennies on the dollar. And there was one more document. An email, printed out, that should never have been in any public file. That old black professor thinks he can keep that land because his ancestors earned it. Honey, we built this neighborhood. It's time the property went to people who belong here. Signed, TJP. I sat in that records office for a long time, holding that email. Margaret Ann pretended not to notice the tears on my face. They weren't tears of grief. They were tears of rage. The kind of rage that burns slow and hot and doesn't stop until everything that caused it has been reduced to ash. Mount Zion Baptist Church has stood on the corner of Oak Street and Freedom Road since 1867. It was founded by freedmen just like Isaiah, built with their own hands from lumber they milled themselves. The original building burned down in 1912. Arson, everyone knew, though nothing was ever proved. And the congregation rebuilt it bigger and stronger within a year. The pews are original, scarred with the marks of generations who held on to them during sermons that spoke of justice and perseverance. The piano is older than anyone still alive, its keys yellowed but its voice still strong. And every Sunday for 157 years, black families have gathered there to pray, to sing, and to remind each other that faith and community are the only weapons that never fail. I hadn't missed a Sunday service since Dorothy's funeral. She loved that church. She sang in the choir for 30 years, her voice rising like honey and light above the others. Sometimes I still hear her during the hymns. Sometimes I still feel her standing beside me in the pew we shared for 4 decades. Pastor James Holloway met me at the door like he did every Sunday, but this time his grip on my hand was different, stronger, more purposeful. "Brother George," he said, pulling me into a hug that smelled of old hymnals and aftershave. "We've heard what's happening. The whole congregation has heard." "Word travels fast," I said. "Word travels when it needs to." He stepped back and looked at me with eyes that had seen 3 generations of carvers grow up in his church. "We're not going to let this stand." After the service, a sermon on David and Goliath that felt particularly pointed, Pastor Holloway called a meeting. 200 people gathered in the fellowship hall, filling every folding chair, lining the walls 3 deep, spilling out into the hallway. I recognized faces from my whole life. People who'd known my parents, my grandparents, people whose families had been intertwined with mine since the days when owning land was an act of rebellion. Miss Ernestine Williams was there, sitting in the front row with her cane across her lap. The Henderson brothers, who ran the auto shop on Main Street. Dr. Patricia Coleman, who delivered half the babies in the black community for the past 30 years. The Washingtons and the Jordans. Families I'd heard had been pushed out of Magnolia Heights. Now I understood what that meant. I told them everything. Showed them the documents, the photographs, the emails. I laid out the evidence like I was presenting to a jury, because in a way, I was. These were the people who would decide whether I fought alone or whether I fought with an army. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Mrs. Ernestine Williams stood up. She's 89 years old. Her grandmother knew Isaiah Carver personally. "My grandma told me about Isaiah," she said, her voice thin but strong. "Told me how he walked 40 miles barefoot to buy that land. How he planted those trees with his own 2 hands while white folks told him he'd never keep it." She looked around the room. "They're not taking it, not while any of us are alive." The room erupted, not with chaos, with purpose, with the sound of 200 people deciding together that some things are worth fighting for. Pastor Holloway raised his hands for quiet. "What do you need, Brother George?" "I need witnesses," I said. "I need documentation. I need people who can watch my property day and night so nothing else gets destroyed. And I need a lawyer who understands what we're really fighting." "My cousin Diane," called a voice from the back. "She works with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in Atlanta. Property rights and civil rights. She's won cases against bigger bullies than this." "Call her," I said. By the time I left that church, I had a 24-hour watch schedule for my property. A phone tree that could mobilize 100 people in 15 minutes, and the name of an attorney who'd spent her career doing exactly what I needed done. I also had something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Diane Washington arrived 3 days later. She drove up from Atlanta in a Mercedes that had seen better days, wearing a suit that hadn't. She was 45, dark-skinned, with natural hair she wore in braids that fell past her shoulders. Harvard Law, 15 years of practice, a reputation for being the kind of lawyer who made powerful people nervous. We sat in my kitchen while she went through the documents. She read for 4 hours straight, making notes, asking questions, occasionally whistling low under her breath. When she finally looked up, her expression was fierce. "Mr. Lester, no band us." "Carver," she said, "this isn't just fraud. This isn't just theft. This is textbook racially motivated property appropriation." She tapped the email with Tammy's words. The language here, combined with the pattern of behavior, combined with the systematic targeting of your family's land. We can pursue this as a hate crime. "A hate crime," I repeated, "for stealing pecans? For attempting to steal your family's 134-year legacy because of your race." She opened a law book she'd brought with her. Georgia Code 17-10-17. Hate crime sentencing enhancement. If we prove racial motivation, and we can, every charge they face gets significantly worse. She started laying out the strategy. Document everything. Build an airtight chain of evidence. Connect with other victims. Because she was certain, looking at the pattern, that we weren't the first family they'd targeted. "Someone inside that HOA must have seen things," she said. "Heard things. We need a witness." I thought about the emails I'd found misfiled. Someone had put them in that public folder. Someone with access. Someone who wanted them to be found. "I might know where to start looking," I said. The call came at 10 p.m., 2 nights later. Unknown number. A woman's voice, trembling. "Mr. Carver? My name is Melissa. I work for the HOA. For Mrs. Perkins." There was a long pause. "I need to talk to you, but not here, not anywhere they might see." We met at a diner 40 miles outside of town, in a booth at the back where no one would look twice at a black man and a white woman having a conversation. She'd suggested the location, far enough from Magnolia Heights that the chances of being recognized were slim. Melissa was in her 30s, mousy brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, nervous hands that kept shredding her napkin into smaller and smaller pieces. She ordered coffee but didn't drink it, just wrapped her hands around the cup like she needed something to hold on to. She told me she'd been Tammy's assistant for 2 years, answered her emails, scheduled her meetings, sat in the back of the room taking notes while the board discussed business. She told me her husband was black, a software engineer, met him at college, married 15 years now. Her children were biracial, 8 and 6 years old, attending schools where they were often the only brown faces in their classes. She told me she'd sat in meetings where Tammy said things Melissa couldn't repeat without her voice breaking, without tears forming in the corners of her eyes, without that shredded napkin becoming confetti on the table between us. "I can't sleep anymore," she said, finally meeting my eyes. "I keep thinking about what they're doing to you, what they've done to others, and I keep thinking, that could be my husband. That could be my kids someday when they grow up and try to build something." She'd been copying files for months, slowly, carefully, covering her tracks with the paranoid precision of someone who knew what would happen if she got caught. She'd put those emails in the public folder, hoping someone would find them, someone who would understand what they meant and have the courage to do something about it. She documented everything she could lay her hands on. "There's more," she said, sliding a flash drive across the table. Her hand trembled as she let go of it. "Board meeting recordings. Private emails. The financial records Karen thinks are encrypted but really aren't. And a list." "A list?" "They call it the Community Enhancement Priority Map." She said the words like they tasted bitter. "It shows every property in Magnolia Heights owned by black families. All of them are marked for redevelopment opportunity. Some have timelines, some have notes about how to pressure the owners. She finally took a sip of her cold coffee. "You're not the first, Mr. Carver. 3 families have already been pushed out in the last 5 years. The Washingtons, the Jordans, the Temples." I knew those names. The Washington family had owned a small farm on the east side of the development. They'd sold suddenly and moved out of state. The Jordans had that beautiful Victorian on Maple Street. They'd lost it to foreclosure after a series of unexplained code violations. The Temples house burned down, I said slowly. Melissa wouldn't meet my eyes. The investigation said it was electrical, but Mrs. Perkins, she was very happy about it. She said, Melissa swallowed. She said it was proof that those people couldn't maintain property properly. I took the flash drive. It felt heavier than its size. "Why are you doing this?" I asked. Melissa finally looked at me. Her eyes were wet. "Because my mother raised me better," she said. "And because when my children ask me what I did when I saw evil, I want to be able to tell them I did something." The evidence on that flash drive changed everything. I called a meeting at Mount Zion. Diane came up from Atlanta. Pastor Holloway gathered everyone who needed to know. We spread the documents across the fellowship hall tables and built the picture together. 3 families systematically targeted over 5 years. Fraudulent code violations, manipulated property assessments, insurance cancellations that came from nowhere. All of it orchestrated by Tammy Jo Perkins and her husband's development company. And my land, with its century-old pecan grove, was the crown jewel. $4.2 million in development potential. $200,000 in annual harvest revenue they'd already been stealing. All of it sitting there, waiting to be taken from a family that had held it since 1890. Diane laid it out. "We're not just looking at fraud and theft anymore. We're looking at a RICO case. Organized, systematic targeting of black property owners with the intent to illegally seize their land. That's federal. That's prison time. That's exactly the kind of case the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division was made for." "How long until we can move?" I asked. "We need more documentation. We need the other families to testify. We need everything locked down tight so there's no way they can wriggle out." She looked at me seriously. "Weeks, maybe a month. Can you hold on that long?" I thought about my trees. My wounded, poisoned, damaged trees that had stood for over a century. "I can hold on," I said. "I've been holding on my whole life." 2 nights before we were scheduled to file our federal complaint, I woke to the sound of chainsaws, not the mechanical hum of the tree shaker this time, not the industrial efficiency of thieves who wanted to steal a harvest. This was different. This was the angry, violent scream of blades biting into living wood. This was destruction for its own sake. I was out of bed and running before I was fully awake. Bare feet on cold ground, nightshirt flapping in the August night air. The security cameras we'd installed were sending alerts to my phone, but I didn't need them to know what was happening. I could hear it. I could feel it in my bones. The grove was lit up with work lights, portable floods on tripods, casting harsh white circles in the darkness. 3 figures in dark clothes moved among the trees. Chainsaws roared, and in the harsh white glare, I saw them attacking one of my trees. Not just any tree. Martin, the tree I'd planted in April 1968, 1 week after they murdered Dr. King in Memphis. I was 11 years old. I didn't understand everything that was happening in those terrible days. The riots, the grief, the fear. But I understood enough to know that something precious had been taken from the world. Something that could never be replaced. So I asked my father if I could plant a tree. A memorial. Something that would grow and live and remember when everyone else had moved on. He gave me a seedling from Isaiah, the patriarch, and together we put it in the ground on a spring afternoon when the world felt broken and the future felt uncertain. 57 years that tree had grown, 57 rings in its trunk, one for each year since the dreamer died. It had survived ice storms that took down power lines across the county. It had survived the drought of 1998 when we had to haul water by hand to keep the grove alive. It had survived blight and beetles and 2 hurricanes that reached all the way inland. It had stood through all of it, growing stronger every year, reaching higher toward the sky. It would not survive this. I screamed. I don't remember what I said, but I know I screamed. The figures looked up, startled. One of them, the one with the chainsaw, hesitated for just a moment. And then the congregation of Mount Zion came running. They'd been keeping watch in shifts, just like we'd planned. 6 of them that night, camping in folding chairs near the property line. When they heard my scream and saw the lights, they came. The attackers ran, dropped their equipment, and fled into the darkness toward a white pickup truck parked on the access road. But the cameras had been running the whole time, and in the chaos, one of them made a mistake. He pulled off his ski mask to wipe the sweat from his face. Just for a moment. Just long enough. I recognized him immediately. Daryl Perkins. Tammy Joe's son. He'd cut about halfway through Martin's trunk before running. The tree was still standing, but barely. Wounded beyond saving. 57 years of growth, destroyed in minutes by a boy with a chainsaw and his mother's hatred in his heart. Pastor Holloway found me kneeling in the sawdust at Martin's base. I was counting the rings. 57. 1 for each year since Dr. King died. 1 for each year I'd watched that tree grow and remembered what we'd lost and what we'd built from the ashes. Brother George, Pastor Holloway said softly, I'm so sorry. I looked up at him. My face was wet, but my voice was steady. They think they won something tonight, I said. They think they killed a tree and hurt an old man and proved they're still in control. I stood up, holding a piece of Martin's bark in my hands. But they just handed us everything we need. They just cut down their own defense. The camera footage was crystal clear. 3 men, 1 chainsaw, and Daryl Perkins's face illuminated perfectly in the work lights. Within 24 hours, that footage was on its way to the FBI. 2 days later, we filed our complaint. Federal court, RICO charges, civil rights violations, hate crime enhancements, everything Diane had promised, and more. The courthouse was packed on the day of the hearing. One side filled with Magnolia Heights residents, white faces tight with anxiety. Some of them people I'd nodded to for decades without ever really knowing them. The other side filled with the congregation of Mount Zion and community members who'd driven from 3 counties away to show their support. News cameras lined the back of the room, CNN, MSNBC, 3 local affiliates, and a reporter from the Washington Post who'd been following the story since it went national. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided. 63 years old, 30 years on the bench, and the first black woman to serve on this court. I'd followed her career for years, reading her opinions in the legal journals, admiring the precision of her reasoning. She was known for 3 things: her fairness, her thoroughness, and her complete intolerance for games. Tammy Jo Perkins sat at the defendant's table with her attorney Marcus Whitley, a man whose suits cost more than most people's cars. His reputation was built on getting wealthy clients out of trouble they'd clearly caused. He'd never lost a case in this county. He looked confident, polished, like this was just another day at the office. Tammy looked the same. She dressed carefully. Softer colors than her usual power suits, a string of pearls that suggested old money and respectability. She looked like she'd never lost anything in her life and couldn't imagine starting now. Diane stood when Judge Hendricks called the court to order. She'd worn her natural hair down today, a deliberate choice, I knew. A statement. Your Honor, she began, this case is not about trees. It is not about homeowners association fees or community standards or any of the technical language the defense will try to hide behind. She paused, letting the silence build. This case is about 134 years of American history, and it is about a systematic pattern of racial hatred masquerading as community governance. She walked to the projection screen and began building the case piece by piece. I watched the faces of the jury, the gallery, even Judge Hendricks, as each piece of evidence landed like a body blow. The original deed from 1890, signed by Isaiah Carver with an X because he'd never been taught to read or write, witnessed by the county clerk and filed properly in the records that still existed today. The fraudulent survey, signed by a disgraced surveyor whose license had been revoked for doing exactly this kind of work. The contract funneling $200,000 a year to Tammy Perkins' personal accounts, while the HOA's books showed nothing. Then the emails. Diane read them aloud, every word echoing in that courtroom. That old black professor thinks he can keep that land because his ancestors earned it. She let the quotation marks land hard. Honey, we built this neighborhood. It's time the property went to people who belong here. Someone in the gallery gasped. A woman in the Magnolia Heights section put her hand over her mouth. Diane continued with the recorded board meetings, playing clips that made even the defense attorney wince. Language. I won't repeat, but language that left no doubt about what these people thought of their black neighbors. The map marking every black-owned property for redevelopment. The testimony of the Washington, Jordan, and Temple families. 3 families who'd lost everything to this same machine before I'd even known it existed. And finally, the video. Darryl Perkins pulling off his mask, his face clear as day in the work lights. The chainsaw biting into Martin's trunk. The sound of 57 years of history being murdered in the dark by a boy with his mother's hatred in his heart. The courtroom was silent when she finished. Even the Magnolia Heights residents wouldn't look at Tammy anymore. Some of them, I realized, hadn't known. Some of them had lived in that community, paid their dues, followed the rules, and never understood what their HOA president was really doing in their name. Judge Hendricks turned to the defense table. Mr. Whitley, your response? Whitley stood, smoothing his tie, but before he could speak, Tammy pushed past him. This is ridiculous, she said, her voice sharp with the particular confidence of someone who has never been told no. That land should never have been... Whitley grabbed her arm. Tammy, don't... She shook him off. Should never have been sold to them in the first place. It was 1890, for God's sake. They didn't even have the right to own property. The courtroom erupted. Judge Hendricks slammed her gavel. Mrs. Perkins, you will control yourself, or you will be held in contempt. But Tammy was beyond control now. The mask had slipped completely, and all the poison she'd been hiding came pouring out. My great-grandfather built this community. He made it what it is, and I will not let some descendants of slaves... Mrs. Perkins! The judge's voice cracked like thunder. Take what belongs to real families. The silence that followed was absolute. Every person in that courtroom had heard what she said. Every camera had recorded it. Every pretense of legitimacy had been stripped away. Tammy seemed to realize, belatedly, what she'd done. Her face went pale. Whitley had taken 2 steps away from her, physically distancing himself from the wreckage. Diane spoke into the silence. Your Honor, I believe Mrs. Perkins just provided the court with direct evidence of racial animus. She walked back to the evidence table and picked up a small paper bag. But if there's any remaining doubt about her credibility... She pulled out a Pecan and held it up. Mrs. Perkins stated in her deposition that she personally inspected the Carver Grove multiple times and found the nuts to be of poor quality, unsuitable for commercial harvest. She claimed expertise in agricultural assessment as justification for the HOA's actions. She walked toward the defendant's table. I'd like Mrs. Perkins to demonstrate that expertise now. Just one nut. just to prove she actually knows what she's been harvesting. Tammy stared at the pecan in Diane's hand. Something flickered across her face. Fear. I don't have to prove anything to you. It's a simple request, Mrs. Perkins. You claimed in sworn testimony that you evaluated these nuts personally. Surely you can taste one. Objection, Whitley said weakly. Overruled. Judge Hendricks leaned forward. I'd like to see this myself. Mrs. Perkins, please demonstrate your agricultural expertise. Tammy reached for the nut. Her hand was trembling. She cracked it open slowly, the shell splitting with a sound like breaking bones. She brought it toward her mouth and stopped. I can't. Can't? Diane asked. Or won't? A long, terrible pause. I'm allergic. The words came out in a whisper. I'm severely allergic to tree nuts. I've never touched a pecan in my life. The courtroom exploded. She'd never inspected the grove. She'd never evaluated the harvest. Every word in her deposition, every claim of agricultural expertise, every justification for stealing my family's legacy. All of it had been lies. And then we all watched as Tammy Jo Perkins' face began to swell. Just being near the nuts was triggering a reaction. Her eyes watered, her skin flushed red. She started scratching at her arms, her neck, unable to stop herself. Call an ambulance, someone shouted. They led her out of the courtroom, medical personnel rushing to help, while cameras captured every moment of her breakdown. The woman who had tried to steal my family's land, who had called us less than human, who had plotted to destroy everything my ancestors had built, undone by the very trees she'd tried to take. Judge Hendricks waited until the commotion died down. Then she removed her glasses and looked out at the courtroom with an expression I'll never forget. In 30 years on this bench, she said, I have seen many things. Fraud, corruption, greed disguised as righteousness. But this, she shook her head slowly. This is one of the most egregious cases of racially motivated criminal conspiracy I have ever witnessed. She turned to the federal prosecutors who had been observing from the side of the courtroom. I'm referring this case immediately to the Department of Justice. I'm recommending hate crime enhancements for all charges, and I'm ordering the immediate seizure of all assets connected to the defendant's criminal enterprise. She looked at me then. A long, measured look between two black people who understood what this moment meant. Miss Carver, she said, your family's property is recognized by this court as exactly what your documents say it is. 40 acres of Georgia land, legally purchased in 1890, held continuously by the Carver family for 134 years. No HOA has jurisdiction. No survey can change that. This land is yours. I couldn't speak. I just nodded. She gathered her papers. Court is adjourned. The verdicts came down 4 months later, after a federal trial that made national news. Every major network covered it. The New York Times ran a 3-part series on the case and the broader pattern of discriminatory HOA practices across the South. Congress held hearings. The Department of Justice announced a review of civil rights enforcement and property disputes. But the numbers mattered most. Tammy Jo Perkins, 8 years in federal prison. Fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, civil rights violations with hate crime enhancement. $280,000 in restitution to my family for the stolen harvests and the damaged trees. $150,000 in fines. A lifetime ban from holding any position in any homeowners association in any state. Her name would appear on a federal database of convicted civil rights violators for the rest of her life. Marcus Perkins, her husband, 12 years. His development company had been the engine of the whole scheme, and the investigators found evidence of similar tactics in 3 other counties. The FBI was still working those cases. They dissolved Perkins' development and seized everything: the cars, the boat, the vacation home in Florida, every asset that had been built on stolen money and broken families. Daryl Perkins. 4 years for destruction of property with hate crime enhancement. He cried at his sentencing, sobbed about how his mother had manipulated him, how he didn't really understand what he was doing, how he was sorry. I felt nothing. Martin's stump was still in my grove, a monument to what happens when hate goes unchecked. The judge who sentenced him was direct. You destroyed 57 years of living history because your mother told you to. You were an adult. You made a choice. Now you'll live with the consequences. The Magnolia Heights HOA was dissolved by court order, its charter revoked, its assets distributed to settle claims. The fraudulent boundary assessments were thrown out. Every correction they'd made to property lines in the past decade was reversed. The 3 families who had been pushed out before me, the Washingtons, the Jordans, and the Temples, were granted the right to sue for damages. Mrs. Washington, who I'd known since she was a little girl running through my grove, called me crying the day the settlement was announced. "We can go home," she said. "Professor Carver, we can finally go home." My family received $340,000 in total compensation, 3 years of stolen harvest at market rates, plus damages for tree destruction, plus emotional distress. Not nearly what the land was worth. Not nearly what 134 years of history was worth. But that was never the point. The point was that we were still standing, 6 months after the trial ended. On a spring morning when the world was waking up green and warm, I stood in my grove where Martin had fallen. The stump had been removed. The ground had been prepared, and in my hands I held a seedling. 200 people had gathered to watch. The congregation of Mount Zion, community members from 3 counties, reporters who wanted to document the ending. And Diane Washington, who had become more than just my lawyer in the months since everything began. Pastor Holloway read the same blessing his great-grandfather had read when Isaiah planted the first tree in 1890. Then he stepped back, and all those eyes turned to me. I knelt in the dirt. My granddaughter Maya, 8 years old, knelt beside me. Together, we placed the seedling in the hole we dug. Together, we pushed the soil around its roots. Together, we patted it down and gave it water. "What's this tree's name, Grandpa?" Maya asked. I looked at her, then at the grove around us. 46 trees that had survived everything the Perkinses had thrown at them, standing tall and patient and eternal. "Justice," I said. "This tree's name is Justice." A reporter pushed forward. "Mr. Carver, what would you say to people who told you to just sell and move on?" I stood up slowly, my knees protesting the way they always do now. I brushed the dirt from my hands and looked out at the cameras, the faces, the grove that had been my family's sanctuary for 134 years. In 1890, I said, my great-great-grandfather Isaiah stood right here. He had nothing except his freedom and a dream. They told him a black man couldn't own land, couldn't build a legacy, couldn't matter. The crowd was silent. He planted 47 trees, 1 for every year his father was enslaved. He said those trees would stand when he was gone. They would feed his children and his children's children, and nobody would ever take from a Carver again. I looked at Maya, who was watching me with the kind of attention only children can give. 134 years later, someone looked at these trees and saw money, saw opportunity, saw something to take. Because some people never stopped believing that what we build doesn't belong to us. I turned back to the cameras, but here's what they never understood. These trees don't just grow from soil, they grow from sacrifice, from resistance, from every generation that refused to give up. I touched the bark of Isaiah, the oldest tree, the one my ancestor had planted with his own hands in an act of faith and defiance. My family didn't survive slavery, Jim Crow, and 100 years of "you don't belong here" just to hand over our legacy to someone with a clipboard and a grudge. These roots go deeper than any lie they can write on paper, deeper than any hate they carry in their hearts. These roots go all the way back to 1890, to a free man who decided that his children would never be property again. I looked around the grove one more time. 46 ancient trees and one new one, all of them part of my family's story now. And as long as one carver is standing, these trees stand with us. That night, after everyone had gone home and the cameras had packed up and the grove was quiet again, I walked out alone. The moon was full, casting silver light through the branches. The spring peepers were singing from the creek that runs along the property's edge. And somewhere in the darkness, an owl called out, the same call I'd heard every spring night since I was a child. I found myself standing in front of Isaiah, the oldest tree, the first tree, the one that had started everything. I pressed my palm against his bark, feeling the rough texture that had been there since before my grandfather was born, since before the world wars, since before everything that makes up the modern world. "We did it, Prepare," I said. "They came for us, and we held the line. Just like you did. Just like your father would have wanted." I thought about him then. Isaiah, a man born free into a world that wasn't ready for him. A man who walked 40 miles to file paperwork because no one would give a black man a ride. A man who knew that owning land wasn't just about dirt and crops and money. It was about dignity. It was about declaring to the world that you existed, that you mattered, that you were not going to disappear just because someone wanted you to. He never learned to read or write. He signed his deed with an X. But he understood something that Tammy Jo Perkins, with all her education and her business plans and her fancy lawyers, would never understand. Some things are worth more than money. Some things are worth more than profit. Some things are priceless. The wind stirred the branches above me, and for just a moment it sounded like voices. All the carvers who had stood in this grove before me. My great-great-grandfather Isaiah, who started it all. His wife Abigail, who tended these trees through drought and flood and the terror of night riders. My great-grandfather James, who fought in the First World War and came home to a country that still wouldn't serve him at a lunch counter. My grandmother Ruth, who made pecan pie every Thanksgiving from these very trees. My father, who taught me how to care for them, how to harvest them, how to love them, all the hands that had tended these trees, all the dreams that had been planted here alongside the pecans, all the hopes and fears and prayers that had been whispered in this grove for 134 years. I'm 67 years old. I've lived long enough to know that the fight is never really over. Somewhere out there, someone else is already planning the next scheme, the next theft, the next attempt to take what doesn't belong to them. That's the nature of the world. That's the reality of being black in America. The constant vigilance, the never-ending awareness that what you've built can be taken if you let your guard down. But I've also lived long enough to know that some things endure. Some things outlast the schemers and the thieves and the small, hateful people who think a clipboard makes them powerful. Some things are rooted too deep to be pulled up, no matter how hard they try. I walked over to the newest tree. Justice, so small now, just a few feet tall, its leaves still that particular light green of fresh growth. In 50 years, it would tower over this grove. In 100 years, my great-grandchildren would stand in its shade. In 134 years, someone would tell the story of how it was planted and why and what it meant. That's the thing about trees. They remember, they witness, they survive. And so do we. I headed back toward the house, my feet finding the familiar path in the darkness. The porch light was on. Maya was staying over tonight, and I could see her face pressed against the window, watching for me. Tomorrow there would be work to do. Trees to tend, a harvest to prepare for, a legacy to maintain. But tonight, I was just an old man walking through a grove planted by a free man in 1890, surrounded by the patient presence of 47 trees that had outlasted everyone who ever tried to take them. 47 trees. One for every year Isaiah's father spent in chains. Still standing, still growing, still ours. On the trunk of Isaiah, just above where my great-great-grandfather had carved his initials so long ago, someone had recently added a new line. The letters were fresh and clean, carved with care. IC 1890, GC 2024, still growing. I smiled, even though my eyes were wet. That's us, I thought. That's all of us. All the carvers who ever were and ever will be. Still growing.